Assalamu alaikum. Miqdad, you forgot to mention my 34 tweets. I wanted to start with a quote. It comes from Kenya's former president, Daniel Arap Moi. So under pressure from Amnesty International, which was reporting on human rights violations by his government, his defiant response was, "Amnesty ni kitu gani?" I don't know if I need to translate that, but literally what it means is, what is this amnesty? Underlying it, it means, why should I care about what these people say? So my talk will address this question in some detail. I don't know if in his retirement President Moi follows SICM's YouTube channel, but maybe he might. So I'll address 2 points. The first is on how human rights NGOs have impact. And this is important because if you think about it, human rights NGOs don't have any physical power. They don't have significant economic power. They don't have a block of votes that they control. All they can do is persuade decision makers, or at least try to persuade decision makers and the public. So I'll give examples of how we try to do that. The second point is whether it is right that leaders and the broader public do pay attention to what human rights NGOs have to say, at least some of the time. Is that a good thing? So before I begin, I wanted to thank the Mahfil for inviting me here. It's a real honor to speak here, and I think it's a topic which is very appropriate to this gathering. Various speakers at Mahfil, such as Imran Panjwani, I think it was a couple of years ago, he described how Islamic values and rules require the protection of human rights, and how many of these values are actually contained within international human rights standards: freedom of religion, the right to water, equality of the races, for example, among many other. Ultimately, at the core of things, the pursuit of justice is a core Islamic duty, and securing justice is what human rights are all about. Now, I'd like to be clear that I'm speaking in a personal capacity rather than as a representative of Amnesty International, and that's for 2 reasons. The first is I'm speaking about human rights NGOs in general rather than of any particular one. And the second is that I normally represent Amnesty on particular areas which I work on, specifically the right to water, sanitation, housing, or in particular research I've carried out, such as on the evictions of people from their homes due to mining in Congo. So today, because I'm speaking on a much broader topic, human rights NGOs in general and the impact we have, I'm representing my own personal views. And just maybe a slight caveat that what I'm saying represents my own personal experiences. So if there are many references to Kenya, that's not necessarily because Kenya is the worst place in the world for human rights. It's just because that's where I've worked. And so I'll be drawing on my work at Amnesty International and also the previous organization I worked for, which was the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions. So I'll start by referring to some of the most important goals of human rights NGOs. One is to convince governments to agree to new and international standards on human rights, so the standard setting. And the second is more of the implementation on the ground, which is changing policies and practices by not only governments, but also corporations who have quite a lot of power and influence, and also intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations and the World Bank. And so human NGOs try to change the way they function on the ground. The way in which this impact is sought, I'll go over 6 ways in which this is done. It's not comprehensive, but these are I think the most important. 1, lobbying. 2, exposing gaps between what governments and corporations say they're committed to and what their actual practice is. 3, showing the real consequences of human rights abuses on people's lives. And by that I mean not just the fact that a legal charter has been broken, but actually what the impact is on people and why we should care. The 4th, public campaigning. 5th, helping affected people fight for their own rights. And 6th, mobilizing or appealing to influential actors that can influence the perpetrator of human rights violations. So I'll start with lobbying. NGOs often have experience in particular subject matter, be it particular right, a particular issue area, and they are able to engage with governments as experts and to try and convince them to change behavior. This works particularly well for topics that are perhaps not the most controversial. So where, for example, at CORE, we engaged with government bodies dealing with water provision or water regulation, and suggested many different ways in which they could more effectively make water affordable in terms of the way you set tariffs, the way allowing more public participation, decision making, and in many cases we were able to make that headway. It did, because especially where it didn't significantly challenge government policies. So there was progress. In fact, one of my team there was saying that, you know what, the government's actually kind of using us as free consultants for them. Fine, as long as the results were adequate. We also would try and give advice to donor agencies that were giving it funding and technical advice to in that case the Kenyan government. And one of the consequences, which I've seen over the course of a few years, is in some of the informal settlements in Nairobi, access to water, basically the slum areas, the access to water has increased. The government rolled out a system where vendors would sell water at relatively regulated prices, and that lowered the cost and increased the quality of the water that was being provided. Some of these things might have happened without NGO input, but we think it did happen because some of the suggestions which we made were actually implemented. Advocacy for international standards often involves a fair amount of lobbying. The UN Convention Against Torture was a treaty that came into being largely as a result of NGO pressure. It was an NGO initiative that then happened as a result of consistent pushing over several years. Another example is the recognition by states of the human rights to water and sanitation as part of international law. That first happened in 2012. And that took many years of lobbying, about 10 years of lobbying. You may think, why was this an issue? And I think that most people think, yeah, of course water and sanitation are human rights or should be human rights. Unfortunately, it took a bit longer than that. We had some governments, including Canada and the United Kingdom, and that was way back in 2002, which were significantly opposed to the idea of expanding the corpus of human rights. But ultimately, they changed position, and as in 2012, that the decision was made: right to water and sanitation are part of international law. Why is this important? What the United Nations say in terms of international law? And I think the impact is something you can actually see at the national level, where new constitutions that are being developed in a wide range of countries, Zimbabwe, Kenya, and others, are including these rights in the constitution, which means people can actually go to court to claim these rights. So, for example, when people are being disconnected arbitrarily from water, or they're being denied access without any good reason, these things can be challenged. And the NGO role there was to sometimes just put something on the agenda by keeping bugging governments to push them to take it forward. In other cases, to find supportive governments that agree with what you stand for, but need advice over a long period. So in the negotiations that were happening in Geneva and New York, several NGOs, not just one, two, were engaging with the text, proposing giving suggestions, addressing the counter arguments, and so that's what helped. So the second point, the second way of having impact, is to expose gaps between governments and actors say they're committed to in actual practice. I think this is important because very, very few governments or corporations or other actors would actually admit that we don't believe in human rights, or we don't comply with human rights. I mean, applies even to North Korea, which claims to be committed to human rights. When a government is accused of violating human rights, the response will normally be something like, well, that's not true. What you're saying actually isn't the truth. Or there is some form of justification for the conduct. Israel imposes sanctions on Gaza on the basis of, they as they say, the threat to them, of the security threat. Or it's not our fault, it's somebody else's fault. Or and this is actually perhaps the most constructive way of reacting, is we are actually taking steps to deal with this. We have put this policy in place, we have appointed a committee. So this is how governments tend to react. And many of these responses can actually be addressed through good research and policy analysis. I'll give an example. So in Congo, we did work on a forced eviction where the police there bulldozed hundreds of homes and businesses belonging to people in Kawama, which is next to a mining concession. The company there had complained about encroaches to its mine. And and following that complaint, this operation happened. About 387 structures were destroyed. Now, the company involved was one owned by a Belgian company, and its bulldozers were actually the ones used to carry out the demolition under the guidance of the police. So after this event, the Belgian company denied the scale of these evictions. It said that only the homes of a small number of the encroachers had been demolished, but not the people who had been residing in the area overall. And so you had a conflict of facts. Now, the way we addressed that was to carry out significant research into this. These days, it's possible to obtain satellite imagery for free. Actually, this offered to NGOs, which showed the situation before the event and after the event. And with that, we were actually able to give a pretty exact number of exact figure as to how many homes had been demolished and of what type. We also obtained photographic evidence from photos that had been taken a couple of days after the demolitions by some local NGOs, videos. We interviewed government officials who had carried assessments. So basically, with all of that, we were able to put that in a report, make it public, and the press release effectively, the whole tenor of it was, this company lied. Here's the evidence. And after that, the company changed its view and it said, no, we had said that it was, our information was according to our sources. We were not lying to you. Yeah. So, but now it claims it was not responsible. That basically, look, the government forced our bulldozer drivers to demolish these homes. And we address that by looking very closely at the factual record, and sometimes the statements of the company itself were quite revealing. That the company didn't even say that we protested. So all of the things it did not do, and we pointed these out, that the company asked the police to intervene, but it did not take any steps to ensure that human rights abuses did not carry out. Such abuses were foreseeable in the context of the country, that it did not protest, that over the whole period of the demolitions, it made no complaint to the government at that time. And then subsequent to the demolition, it actually defended what the government had done. So again, we were able to use evidence to show the truth of what had actually happened. This is actually quite recent, so we're still at the moment carrying out our advocacy to the company, the Congolese government, and also the Belgian government, to ensure that a Belgian company, respects rights abroad. The Congolese government has said that they're starting prosecutions for these, and we'll follow up on that. That's I think an example of how evidence can actually shift government and corporate action. So another example, the third way of having impact, is to try and show the real consequences of human rights abuses on people's lives. One example was in Slovenia, where people were, this is mainly members of the Roma community, were denied access to water close to their home. They're people who live in informal settlements. They can't have access to formal housing effectively due to discrimination. And so their consequence is to get water. In one case, somebody has to go to a cemetery and take water from a tap from the cemetery and take it back to his home. Now it's important to carry out further research to actually what this means, and we delved into it. Some of our colleagues delved into it. So it's not just the inconvenience of having to go and collect the water. It means that you cannot collect enough water to regularly take showers, and what this means is the children in that family can't go to school, because if they go to school, they'll have gone without a shower. Their friends will say, "Oh, you're a smelly Roma," and as a result, they feel unable to go to school. So effectively, the consequence is much more than having to go and collect water. It means children are actually denied education. Our work on informal settlements in Nairobi showed how people do not have access to a safe toilet because the government does not require the owners of the houses to build toilets right next to the homes. So basically, people living there need to walk to public toilets, which can be sometimes as much as 10 minutes away from their homes. A 10-minute walk to the toilet on its face may seem inconvenient, but what it means, and we were able to show this, the evidence from interviews with women affected, is that it means you cannot go out at night. You cannot use the toilet at night. It's just not safe, and there's a risk of rape if you do that. So some of these showing this this information, and in many cases, it's accompanied with testimonies from the actual people affected. You know, the photos, people telling their own stories, and we try and use that to show the impact, and that has helped actually in promoting the recognition of the right to sanitation in international law. In Slovenia, we saw some changes in certain municipalities, and in Kenya, unfortunately, on that particular point, we didn't see any change because it has to do with the issue of informal land ownership, where the government is quite resistant to make significant changes. The fourth aspect is of having impact is public campaigning. Let's do a time check. Now, through, as you can expect, petitions, lobbying, and Amnesty is quite good. Amnesty International is quite good at that because there's a heavy focus on letter writing. It's able to do that because there's a large number of membership, a large number of members and supporters around the globe. It's estimated about 7 million. So you might actually want to think about joining Amnesty International because it's an important way to engage in the promotion of human rights. There are others who are actually very good at this. Avaz, you may have heard of, is very good, especially very good in terms of online petitions. The fifth mode is by helping affected people to fight for their own rights, and that's something that's become much more popular. It's much more sustainable for people to defend rights themselves rather than rely on NGOs who may be there one day, but after a few years may not be able to do so. And so some of the ways that can be done is by showing them that what is happening to them is actually contrary to standards that their own government has committed to abiding by. And that sometimes can be quite powerful when you say, look, governments around the world agree that what's happened to you is wrong. So it's not, you know, if you're imprisoned, torture isn't something that just happens because you're unlucky to be there. It should not occur. Some of the other ways NGOs can help is by actually helping people affected to actually understand who the responsible government actors are and understand the system, because sometimes the system is actually very confusing, and sometimes perhaps intentionally so, to prevent people holding governments to account. I've seen this in Nairobi by Amnesty and other organizations. An organization called Haki Jamii was very good at that, helping communities, also helping them to set up their own organizations, helping them with things like, you know, even financial management, and creating effective structures. And some of these groups are very effective in opposing forced evictions. So when the police go in and decide to simply just demolish the houses of people living in slums rather than relocating them somewhere, we now see situations where those people have allies from other settlements who come to their aid, who try and make a noise about it, carry out demonstrations even, and what that does is dissuade forced evictions as a way of as a tool of government policy. Sixth tool is by mobilizing to influential actors that can influence the perpetrator. So there are many governments that are impervious to direct pressure, and so their NGOs will often go to others. So some of the obvious tactics are to go to court, to litigation, sometimes to international human rights treaty bodies. Now these are for the various international standards that have been set up. Governments elect independent experts who review government performance every few years, and the decisions of these committees can actually be quite influential. And for an NGO perspective, it's extremely helpful to say, look, the United Nations Committee on, for example, Civil and Political Rights agrees that this is wrong, or that, you know, the Inter-American Court on Human Rights is saying that this is wrong. It increases your influence in that circumstance. Sometimes NGOs will ask other governments to act. Calling on them to raise the issue in diplomacy and to call on other governments to comply with human rights. So there are many governments that will actually do that. So for example, European governments will be quite sometimes willing to raise issues with African governments or Latin American governments. Interestingly enough, they tend to be quite reluctant to raise it with other European governments, which is something we try to challenge them on, because it's a double standard there. But anyway, you use that to the extent that you can. The second point is to ask other governments to refrain from providing, and this we argue is actually a legal obligation. They have to refrain from providing any support to these violations. So to refrain from supplying arms, or funding where there is a risk that it will be used for human rights violations. So, for example, amnesty pressure convinced the South Korean government to stop supplying tear gas to Bahrain, as an example, a recent one. Some NGOs, and this is a point of difference, is that some NGOs go further and actually call for broader boycotts and sanctions against governments that commit human rights abuses. There's a difference of views there as to when you call for sanctions, when it could actually be more harmful than good, and we could discuss that. One example of this was when in 2004, when a new government came in and all of a sudden, perhaps not even really thinking it through, ordered evictions in Nairobi's informal settlements that would have affected hundreds of thousands. And so in that case, you had a whole range of African NGOs, international NGOs, complaining to the government, bringing in calling on the United Nations to step in and criticize the evictions, which they did. In fact, even going to the Pope, because one of our partner NGOs had grown out of the Catholic movement, and went to the Pope. The president at the time was a Catholic, so that seemed to have had some influence. The evictions were called off. We don't know exactly what it was that stopped the evictions, but the fact is you do need to try all these different forms of pressure. In the case of corporations, many NGOs originally started out, and by corporations, I'm thinking more of the violations that are carried out through pollution by mining industries, or evictions of people where companies want to get people off their land for mining purposes. That's generally one of the best examples we've seen. Originally, we were more trying to convince them to abide by human rights, to act in a social responsible way. Some NGOs still do that, but most have now moved on to actually focusing on asking governments to regulate companies, because that's where the real power is. Governments are able to apply laws, and also governments also provide significant amounts of funding to companies for investment purposes, and that, if turned off, could have a significant influence. And it has, in practice, actually changed a lot of corporate behavior. We think it would be a lot worse if it wasn't for these efforts. So with all these things, I mean, why do human rights violations still go on? And I guess the answer is many governments have other objectives other than the protection of human rights. In some cases, they put the survival over human rights, or in some cases staying in power. But I believe that what human rights NGOs do is to increase the costs of carrying out human rights abuses. You have to think more, as a government, you need to think about, if I do this, it will have these consequences on my reputation. It may affect my individual reputation. It may actually even end me up in court. At the very minimum, I know that I'll be getting, maybe hundreds of letters that I have to deal with. People will be bothering me. And what this means is, I think that governments that to carry out these abuses will think twice about it. There's a long way to go, because we cannot say that any one country in the world respects human rights perfectly. Every government has abuses. Every government has blind spots, committed to the broad range of human rights, but maybe not for Roma, maybe not for others. So in the questions, I'd welcome your contributions, your suggestions on other ways that may be useful. I'll move on to the second point, which is on why do NGOs have the right to the influence that they do? And the short answer to that is that NGOs, human rights NGOs, are calling for the implementation of standards that have been agreed to by all governments. The most important is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and this was a declaration adopted by the United Nations in 1948. That's a standard which covers civil and political rights, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, ranging to economic and social rights, the right to housing, the right to food, and others. And countries at the United Nations repeatedly declare their commitment to this declaration. They will fulfill it. Now, more recently than the declaration are human rights treaties. Now, a treaty is legally binding international law, and some of the most important ones I'll mention are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and that one 168 states have ratified, meaning they're legally bound by it under international law. And the International Covenant International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights which has 162 countries which have ratified it. These were agreed upon in 1966, which means that most of the current membership of the United Nations were represented in those discussions. The exceptions may be, the Commonwealth of Independent States and the states that emerged after 1966, but most were there. And these covenants are constantly reaffirmed by the UN General Assembly as standards which guide all states. In addition to these international treaties, there are also regional human rights treaties, which for Europe, I think, which we're all familiar with, Americas, Africa, and now the Arab League. That's the most recent one. So when human rights NGOs write a report, they will set out the facts, set out the evidence, set out the law, and point to the gaps between them. And that's the source of legitimacy. And it's quite powerful to say that, look, you've accepted these standards, we're just holding you to account. We haven't invented them. Now, of course, there is some debate over the meaning of, as with any text, there's debate of what it means, over what it means. And human rights NGOs normally push for interpretation which provides for the greatest possible protection of the rights of individuals. An example is that the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights refers to the right to an adequate standard of living, including food, clothing, and housing. Now, there's a debate over that. The right to an adequate standard of living, does it include water and sanitation? Now, we argued for a long time that obviously water and sanitation is as important, if not more important, than food, housing, and clothing. And the committee of experts elected by governments to interpret that treaty agreed. Some governments, the UK in particular, said, no, I don't see the word water in the treaty. And so you had these arguments which, the literal versus purposive interpretation. And after a while, the purposive interpretation won out. It took a few years, but it's done. Now, to be legitimate, human rights work must be independent, impartial, accurate, and based on expertise. Now, the criteria of accuracy and expertise is perhaps self-evident. I mean, NGOs will not be listened to if their reports have lots of errors or if they don't act in an authoritative way. The point about independent deserves more discussion. And I'm going to ask for an audience survey here, which is, where do you think Amnesty International gets most of its funds from? It's a multiple choice question. So A, governments, B, corporations, C, charitable foundations, or D, individuals. Okay. So governments, please raise your hands. Okay. This is obviously too easy a question. B, corporations. To C, charitable foundations. Most of its funding, yeah, charitable foundation. Okay, D, individuals. Okay, so it's a tie between charitable foundations and individuals, which is yeah, I think it is. Those are the main sources of funding for Amnesty's work. By the way, when Mikdad sent his email inviting you to the talk, he says the audience is well informed. So there's some evidence of that. Sorry? What's the difference between charitable foundation and individual? Okay, charitable foundations are foundations like Ford Foundation or Rockefeller Foundation. So where somebody has set up a bequest and yeah, you have to apply for it, and they have staff and committees who vet them. There are also some which have been set up through more like even the Catholic or Protestant churches. These foundations that provide funding. By individuals, I mean like somebody he takes out money from his or her own pocket, based on the income. So in Amnesty's case, the answer is actually D, that the 80% of its funding are from individuals. And most of these are from members who provide regular small donations to the organization. That's quite important because it means that you don't have any one person or small group of people who can come and tell you, no, you have to do it differently, otherwise we'll cut off your funding. You may have cases where Amnesty might do something wrong and lose a very small, minuscule part of its income, but it's not really something that's that's worried about. Obviously, the organization would still needs to prove its effectiveness, still needs to reach out, still needs to be present, needs to safeguard the brand, but you don't have the ability of one person to influence, to have excessive influence. So in terms of the policy, Amnesty does not seek or accept any funds for human rights research from governments. I'm reading from its actual text. Does not accept funds for human rights research from governments or political parties, and accept support only from businesses that have been carefully vetted. So what that means in practice is that funding could be taken for things like human rights education project, but never for any work. Okay, that I have 10 minutes left. That would involve monitoring another government. And I think the same is true. I have to be a bit careful because I don't speak for Human Rights Watch and for other big NGOs, but it's generally about that. I mean, they do not accept funding that could jeopardize their independence. That's quite important. Now, not all NGOs have this luxury. To be able to rely on that, you need to have the brand and the for the wider public to know who you are. But small NGOs such as CORE, the organization that I previously worked for, don't have that. So they have to rely on the charitable foundations and even on governments. So, for example, CORE relied on European governments to mainly through their foreign office funding for human rights for their work. Now, in my experience and from seeing the work of other NGOs, I don't think it affects too much their independence. Like, I mean, I think those governments that provide that funding know that you absolutely cannot tell these NGOs you must criticize X, you must criticize Y, because if they did that, there would be a backlash. But what it does mean is that your priorities can be skewed by the availability of funding. So there's a lot of funding available for the protection of civil and political rights, very little funding for the protection of economic and social rights, simply because in terms of these governments, their priority is more on civil and political rights. So it does skew. When CORE was working on forced evictions in Kenya, DFID funded some of that work, but it said, we cannot support any court cases that the organization wanted to bring against the government. And you can see why that would be the case. I mean, for the Kenyan government to know that the British government is funding litigation against them would cause diplomatic issues. But it does have that restriction. But what this means is that NGOs that do rely on government funding need to go the extra mile to prove their impartiality and independence. And I think many of them do that, but yeah, it is an area where they need to be careful. This is particularly actually very important for national NGOs in developing countries, many of which rely on external funding, mostly from foundations, but also from governments, and governments that want the governments that are that feel the heat of their work. That's the first thing they say: you're foreign funded. And I think in Russia a law was passed where NGOs that receive foreign funding need to register as foreign agents. So this is a problem. It reflects, I think, the reality that most charitable funding people find it easier to provide funding for work that involves helping an individual, to build houses, for example. But it's harder to provide funding for work to prevent houses from being demolished by the government. I mean, like, for example, like your homes, right? Can you actually give it for advocacy? I don't know the answer to that. I give my money to LFT. So to be on the safe side. So that's an issue. Another issue is one of perceived independence. You can actually be independent the way you do things, but the perception of your independence matters. So sometimes your perception of an NGO may be influenced by which TV station you listen to or which newspaper you read. Because we find that our press releases on a particular country will get much more coverage by certain outlets, and press releases on other countries will get all the coverage by other outlets. So that can be, unfortunately, not something that NGOs themselves have that much control over. So NGOs often get the question, why do you work on this issue, not on that one? I think one thing to keep in mind is that NGOs will not always work on the most important or the biggest human rights violation in a country. And sometimes there are good reasons for that. Sometimes there may not be good reasons. But one example would be, what do my stakeholders think? You know, for example, if you're a membership organization, your membership will have a say in what issues you work on. You'll also be thinking about what issues you have most impact on, either in the short term or the long term. And sometimes this can be, this may seem a bit unfair, that some NGOs in some cases will target the countries or the actors where you think they actually will shift their position as a result of your work. You may devote less resources to countries that you don't think you can actually change. That may seem unfair, but from the point of view of an NGO, if you want to actually make the change to somebody's lives, you will actually try and do that work where it can actually make a difference. I think that's mainly also a problem for smaller NGOs. I mean, Amnesty and other organizations worked on Burma for the longest time, knowing that there would be very little chance of impact. That impact only came after 20, 30 years of advocacy, and more recently. But some of the other questions would be, where are we best placed to work on a certain area? Are there other NGOs who can do this work better than we can, who may have the expertise, or may be better placed? In one project I worked on in Argentina, we were trying to assist the community secure their right to water. This is an informal settlement. So we designed our project, went and spoke to them, and realized after a while that actually they didn't think water was their biggest problem. They thought actually housing is our biggest problem. So luckily, working for an organization focused on housing rights, we were able to shift and accommodate that. But I mean, there are other organizations whose focus is on food, or other organizations whose focus is on, you know, prevention of torture, and, you know, that's their toolbox, and that's all that they can actually work on. So yeah, just these are just some indications of some of the challenges faced by NGOs. So I'd like to open up to questions.
We have some time for questions. We'll start from either side.
Thank you very much. I was just wondering what kind of impact and what tools does an organization like Amnesty International have when it comes to kind of large and powerful governments, generally ones that are seen as policing the rest of the world? For example, what's come out recently in terms of the US Senate report on CIA, EITs, and what kind of role do you think Amnesty International and other organizations will play in terms of bringing about some form of justice?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, the first thing, if I'll just say as a caveat, I mean, I'm not working on that particular area, but so whatever I say might not be. So, but you asked Amnesty and organizations like that. Well, I mean, Amnesty has been actually working on these abuses for a long time. The Secretary General a few years ago, Aryan Khan, called Guantanamo the Gulag of our times. Was actually criticized because it's, you know, it was perhaps not it's not on the same stage and on the same scale as the Soviet gulags. Some of the other things were actually to call for the prosecution of George Bush by at a certain point where he was planning to travel to Switzerland, on the basis of his admission, effectively in his memoirs, that he had authorized waterboarding, which is torture, and all states that are party to the Convention Against Torture have an obligation to prosecute where the individual is present in the jurisdiction. So some of the tools, asking other governments to raise the issue with the United States, and there are ways you can do it. I mean, of course, the problem is many of the governments in question are implicated themselves. So, yeah, no, it's the fact of a government being powerful doesn't by itself limit NGOs. In fact, it means that your criticisms against that government will actually get more attention. like for example, Amnesty's report on, I'm sorry to switch from torture to, but on drones and the impact of drones in Pakistan. And Human Rights Watch's own report on the impact of drones in Yemen got massive coverage as a result of the fact that, you know, abuses carried out by the United States, that's media worthy. So yeah, some attention can be brought on that. Another tool is you know, direct pressure through the U.S. political process. But it is going to be a hard one in terms of the administration there does not seem willing to be carry out the prosecutions, but NGOs are raising this issue and putting it on the agenda. I mean, future governments will think twice before this happens. But do you have any ideas, or do others have ideas?
Can I ask kind of
sure.
kind of secondary question? I don't know,
If
in terms of,
as long as Miqdad doesn't mind.
in terms of how does it become, I guess, murky and less possible for organizations to do something when the kind of locus of responsibility seems to be kind of ambiguous? So, you know, the CIA is doing things that the White House isn't sure of, and then, or isn't aware of, or Congress isn't aware of, or you know, the president isn't aware of supposedly for a few years. So, I mean, how do you then, and then, I mean, and vice versa, you know, they're saying, well, actually, you know, we were aware, we authorized this. So it seems to be, I guess, how does that kind of, I guess, play a part in terms of potentially prosecutions, or actually kind of bringing people to justice? I don't know if that's, if that it makes the kind of issue a bit murkier.
Right. I mean, in many of those circumstances, our NGOs will call for credible investigations to be carried out. I mean, normally, an NGO itself does not have the same resources or the same access that an official state investigation does have. And so you would be actually calling for that investigative prosecution. And then when that's carried out, pointing to any gaps in such investigation or prosecution doesn't meet with international standards, the expectations that have to be carried out. So you can, the fact of situation being murky does not give, it's not an adequate excuse for a government, because it's their responsibility to shed light on these issues, and so that's where we throw the issue back at them. But I mean, what you're pointing to is actually a big, it's a big part of human rights work in terms of the responsibilities. You know, who knew what when. The same applies with you know, with abuses by non-state, by militia. Are they being controlled by the government? Are they not being controlled? I see it a lot in terms of the international financial institutions when they provide funding. You know, what did they know when? But then the way international standards have developed is that governments have to act, and this is a pretty important point. Governments have to act with due diligence to prevent violations, to prevent violations under their watch and in their territory. And so sometimes we focus less on the outcomes, but more on what governments had an obligation to do to prevent the violation where they might have failed in that respect.
Iqbal.
Okay, thank you, Ashfaq, for that interesting thing. The first thing, I think, Khadija, we should never say EITs, yeah? We should say torture. We shouldn't sanitize torture, right? I agree. I have two questions, observations. Now, first one is, because your area of specialty is Kenya, this dropping of the case against the Kenyan president by the ICC, right? Although the ostensible reason given is that witnesses could not be found, etc., etc., but this is just cover. So I feel that this is a political decision by the West, saying that this is a friend and we cannot really put him out to grass. So I like your observation on that. The second one, which is even more problematic, is the growth of what we call philanthrocapitalism. So you have things like the Gates Foundation, for example, whose resources dwarf not only the NGOs but the UN system altogether as well. Now, that is going to bring a new narrative on this kind of issue, especially when it comes to economic and social rights and so on, yeah? And I don't know how the NGOs will react to that, or whether their work will be completely submerged in this pressure.
Okay. Do you want to elaborate a bit more? How do you think they might be submerged?
You see, for example, I mean, I'm not talking of Gates in particular, but I'm saying a commercially oriented thing will not be very sensitive to abuse of your land rights or whatever, right? When we were working with the World Bank, we had these huge dam projects, which obviously resulted in displacement of millions of people without any, you know, reasonable compensation or relocation. But this is part of progress. In India at the moment, you have lots of mining concessions being really abused. But again, it becomes problematic. Now, this kind of thing can increase if commercial, or not commercial in the sense, but commercially originated funds, they will not take the stance that what we did was wrong.
Okay. All right. So, all right. So just a couple of points. In terms of the dropping of the case, whether it was a political decision, I mean, I really can't say, because I don't really work on the International Criminal Court. I guess my observation might be in the run-up to the election, the Kenyan election, the U.S. Secretary of State Johnny Carson said that choices have consequences, referring to the ICC, and that was widely interpreted as the United States saying, you know, if you elect Kenyatta as president, then it will, you know, it would have an impact on our relationship with Kenya. So since then, of course, the United States has been trying to be quite clear that there's been, you know, it's moved closer to the new government. But whether the ICC was dropped the case, I mean, one thing we have to remember is that the prosecutor is not beholden to one country. And of course, the argument might be that in practice they are, but I mean, the United States isn't a member of the court. And the prosecutor was elected by the states parties to the International Criminal Court, and the majority of them are African and Latin American states. I mean, the Western countries are a minority in the body that actually elected the prosecutor. So that's, I guess, all I could say.
You see, you can see that Kenya has become frontline in the fight against the Shabab.
Yeah.
So clearly, there's an angle there to be thought through.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's not my role to defend the ICC. So, I mean, you know, we've criticized some of their decisions, for example, in terms of not carrying out certain not carrying out certain investigations. So, for example, you know, when Palestine asked to become a party to the, declared that it wanted ICC jurisdiction to apply to it, the then prosecutor said, well, it's not my role to determine whether Palestine is a state or not, and we criticized that. We felt that, you know, it should have actually taken that. So, I mean, NGOs, do criticize the ICC for some of the decisions it's made. Whether they'll criticize the dropping of these charges, we'll have to see. I mean, it's quite recent. The point about the philanthrocapitalism, so there will be likely a lot more private resources going into development, and in fact, that it's not main. I agree with you. It's an issue, and not only will that apply through that route, but a lot of development aid. The trend is now to move it from state to state transfer, but more to provide that funding to corporations, seeing corporations as a way of doing development. It's part of the narrative of more private sector development. The concern there. It's difficult to say, because when there's official aid, World Bank aid, there is not very much one can do to hold these actors to account. I mean, they do have complaints panels and all of that, but they are quite resistant to pressure. And with corporations, we find that corporations sometimes are a little more concerned about their public image. So there's their advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that corporations are more concerned about the image. So in that sense, they are more susceptible to pressure. But on the other hand, there is this profit motive, of course, which can be used to override human rights, and which perhaps isn't the same with public. Either way, there are ways to hold them to account. NGOs have been focusing very significantly on corporate accountability. I mean, the amount of attention is massive. We worked. Did you mention mining in India? I think you did. There was a case where Amnesty worked on of the Vedanta. Yeah, and it's some of its operations which would have displaced some of the indigenous communities, the Adivasis. And yeah, I mean, some of the work that was done was quite effective, and some of that. I mean, there were a lot of local Indian NGOs carrying out a lot of work, the organizations themselves, and as a result, the Supreme Court of India acted to stop some of the expansion into of this mining into their traditional areas, the areas of religious significance. To them. Amnesty also did some campaigning on that, because it was an aluminum mine. So we had activists stand in the streets covered in steel masks. Vedanta, don't foil human rights. It made the metro. Yeah. So yeah. Just at one point, Khadija, you was a volunteer for Amnesty, right? No. So I'm mixing up with somebody else. Excuse me. Okay, but I have another colleague from Amnesty who can also answer questions. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to ask, is there any way that you handle a natural bias? Like, for example, if we just to go back to a difficult question, in some Sunni views in Iraq, what had been written in that report may have been very true for them. So is there any way NGOs deal with the fact that they actually look at two sides of the coin? Because it's very easy, even perhaps, to look at something and think, okay, these people are obviously the poor people, so this is what needs helping. But is there any way to look at two sides of the story?
Do you mean when people complain about things that have happened to them?
Yeah, as in, I think two sides of the coin give a bigger picture, and of course it's really important to take the side of obviously the people who are weaker, but I do think that people who are weaker can also take advantage of that fact, and I was wondering if there's any way that NGOs deal with that, or is there anything that prevents that from happening?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, good research, and I mean, we have research methodology training where we're told, like, you watch out for that. I mean, make sure you are actually, when somebody says, I was taken, I was beaten, etc. You need to, as much as possible, get external evidence. So not just their word. You'll look at their testimony, you look at other testimony, ask them separately what about their stories, and then you'll cross-check these stories. Make sure that there's a thread of that it's consistent. Basically, like you would in a court case, as much as possible. Are these stories consistent? To interview people separately. Do you have photos? Do you have pictures? Do you have medical evidence? those sorts of things? Do you have any written records? Anything that can provide concrete evidence. Part of the methodology is to always you speak to the alleged perpetrator, give them a chance to give their views. I think unfortunately some governments don't take up that opportunity, which they really should, because that will allow their case to be reflected. Although sometimes the best evidence you can get is from putting questions to a government and seeing their responses. Sometimes their own responses will actually reveal the things that they have not done. Do you have a process to monitor what your what the guards in a particular prison are doing? They'll say, no, we trust our guards. Our guards are of the highest character. Well, okay, you've just answered my question. You don't have any process to check your guards. I hope that I'm answering your question to some extent, but if you have, yeah.
Can I ask a question? Well, I'm going to ask myself. One of the corollaries of what's been said so far is how, when Amnesty, for example, looks at one issue, it can't look at every issue by definition. So it'll look at one issue and it will choose to talk about one issue. And you said earlier that some issues, because of the way that they are important, will get mass media coverage, and other issues won't get such media coverage. And based on the ability to potentially make a difference, some might be worked on more than others. So if for example, one might be able to make a change, more research may go into that rather than others. Not stopping the other, but it may influence what's done. In situations like that, is there a potential that reports by Amnesty on one issue may have an unfair impact because of that inconsistency, and fuel a narrative not because of anything that's wrong with the report? The report is exactly right in everything that it says, but by not also talking about another situation, it gives that sort of imbalance. Or even if they talk about it, but it doesn't get picked up because it's not pushed as much because of the narrative, or it's not worked on as detailed. Do you get what I'm trying to say? So how do they deal with that?
Do you, yeah, I mean, do you have any examples in mind?
I think the example I'm giving is primarily what has been talked about previously.
Sure.
In particular, when it comes to Iraq and the militias there, there have been lots of abuses. Like there's been huge abuses from ISIS and Camp Speicher and other places. Like there's huge ones which haven't had the same attention, or they're a little bit, but not comparatively as much. Even though they potentially even had many bigger numbers of people killed, for example. But understandably, they weren't worked on as much because they're not going to get the same media coverage. There's lots of other reasons as well. But that unintentionally may result in a seeming bias from some people, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when I was referring to working on some issues rather than others, one where you can have more of an impact, one place where you wouldn't actually do that is particularly in those types of cases. Like you wouldn't, for example, do a report on Shia militia and give less attention to one on ISIS, because there it's clear that there would be a bias. So, for example, when we do a report on abuses in Gaza by Israel, there's going to be a report on abuses by Hamas, and that's intentionally done to make sure you do actually cover both sides. And the same is being done in Iraq. So when I say you focus on situations where you may have more impact, it may be, it would be, for example, like, in one country as opposed to another country. Like you wouldn't look at the same, conflict and focus more on one rather than others, depending on where you would have more impact. So I mean, I know Amnesty did a report on abuses by ISIS, and that was done in a fair amount of detail. However, I mean, you can see how abuses by ISIS, that's not news. Everybody knows that. But another report. I mean, and also, Human Rights Watch, I think, did some work on that. And I have to confess, I mean, I can't speak with any authority on this. But what you're saying is, you know, it's true. It's important to take account of how the perception is and what you can do to actually affect that. Yeah.
I think we'll end.